in the morning. So let's start. And thank you for your patience. We had a bit of some technical issues. So today's presentation, well, let me just briefly introduce the speakers and the groups. So this presentation is sponsored by Stanford Global Studies through its workshop series, Law and Literature in the Global South, which aims to broaden the horizons of the law and humanities critical paradigm. The group has featured events on the rights of nature and imagination, as well as anti-colonial interdisciplinarity as a heuristic for thinking about the pairing of law and literature. Also co-sponsoring is In Search of Epistemic Justice, a tentative cartography, which is a research group that explores epistemic inequality in various cultural, historical, and geopolitical contexts, including the academy. This group is coordinated by Jaime Barizak, Nicole Bess, Angelo Vanini, and myself, Victoria Zurita. And we recently hosted a very thought-provoking and rich presentation with Professor Jonathan Simakonam. Yes, and law and literature is run by Joe Waiter, who's been spearheading this event. And our speaker is Prathama Banerjee. You please correct me if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, who is a professor and historian at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. She works at the cusp of history and political concepts, literary and cultural history, political philosophy, and philosophies of time. Her books include The Politics of Time, Primitives and History Writing in a Colonial Society from Oxford University Press, and Elementary Aspects of the Political, which is the book that we will be discussing today, Histories from the Global South by Duke University Press. Her current interests consist of tracing charging contours of political ideas across time in South Asia, as well as critical theory of economics interface with democratic politics today. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Joe, who's going to present the structure of the event.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Here it's a little bit early, so I might do a little reading to try to be an aid to my brain as it's waking up and the coffee it's taking its effect. So we're going to start with kind of a back and forth discussion to allow Professor Banerjee to discuss her most recent book, and then we'll also transition into talking about some of her more recent work. And we'd like to leave ample time for Q&A. So feel free to leave questions in the chat. Victoria here will be helping me moderate the chat. And then at the time, again, if people would like to open up their cameras, their microphones, and have questions that aren't written, but also, live as it were, we'd love to have that as well. All right. So before we jump into the first question, I'd just like to say as a caveat that, I come to this with the humility of my disciplinary deformation as a literary scholar focusing on Latin Americanist traditions. So I'm very unversed in so much of the detailed readings that Professor Banerjee you share in this rich scholarship. Yet we in this group and I myself take seriously what you write, that thinking across traditions not only allows us to recover lost and forgotten intellectual cartographies, but also helps us carve out thought regions anew. So in that spirit, and in the spirit of interdisciplinary work under the umbrella of the Global South, I would like to start with an opening question to start discussion of this potent work, which Dilip Mellon has characterized as an extraordinarily nuanced book that embarks on a robust enterprise of generating a mode of thinking from the Global South. So starting here at 7 a.m. in California, 8:30 p.m. in Delhi, let's begin with a bit of background. Could you tell us about how you came to write Elementary Aspects of the Political, Histories from the Global South?
Sure. Thank you very much, Joe, Victoria, and other friends out there. And particularly appreciate those of you who are awake so early in the morning on the West Coast. And thank you very much for your interest in my work. It really does mean a lot to me. So let me just put it very plainly. This particular book is a simple book at heart. It basically studies the rise of modern political concepts in South Asia between the mid-19th and the mid-20th century, with a view to generally rethink, or let me put it more ambitiously, universally rethink what we today recognize as the political. The impulse of the project comes out of a, diffuse everyday sense of dissatisfaction with our received political vocabulary, which, as many of us would agree here, fails to fully account for concrete lives and diverse histories of the world at large. Now, this question started bugging me, and actually not just me, many of my own generation. I think I can speak in a collective voice here. Already by the 1980s and 90s, with respect to Marxism. So many of us growing up in the end of the last century were both trained academically in Marxist historiography and Marxist political philosophy. And many of us were also actively part of left parties, as I myself was. And very soon we started struggling with what appeared to be a mismatch between the concepts and categories that we thought with and the language that came through in our work on the ground. So first questions emerged with respect to Marxism as a worldview, as a political project, as a theoretical framework, which sooner than later extended to other schools of political philosophy, to political philosophy as such, or political theory as such, in the question of the mismatch between our vocabulary and language and life on the ground in general. The question became even more urgent, as all of you would agree, in the last couple of decades, in the early part of the 21st century, when our cherished ideals of freedom, democracy, equality, even humanity came to be challenged in the face of ever increasing inequalities around the world, runaway ecological crisis, the global proliferation of extractive technologies, both digital and analog, and above all, the rise of authoritarianisms by popular consent. So this book then seeks to offer one possible approach, and only one. There are other possible approaches to this question. It's an approach to this current political predicament of ours, which seeks to go back to the beginning, as it were, and rewrite the genealogies of our modern day political grammar. So which I suggest is best done from a counter location. In my case, it is South Asia, but it could very well be Black America or the Maghreb or Palestine or Israel or Haiti or Brazil, erstwhile colonies which best expose the chinks in the armor of currently hegemonic political philosophy and normative theory. So that's where I'm coming from, is it?
There's already a lot to unpack there, and we can come back to these questions of language, questions of equality, and the metaphor you use of the armor, right? We'll come back to specific questions of style and the literary as well. But to continue the conversation, focusing on the title and the genesis of the project, one of the key distinctions you make, and others have made as well, politics in the political. Could you speak to us a little bit about how you make that distinction and the way it kind of opens up different questions in your work?
Yeah, thank you. The thing is that I in the early part of the book, in the ground clearing part, as it were, I actually question that distinction. The distinction between politics and the political came to us primarily from continental political philosophy, from Carl Schmitt to diversity of philosophers, including Claude Lefort and Jacques Rancière and so many others. Now, Jean-Luc Nancy, many people, mostly coming from the French and German philosophical traditions. Now, even though these are very different philosophers with very different political predilections, one thing that I find common amongst them is this distinction that they make between the political and politics. And the basic argument that drives this distinction is that there is something called the political, which is a priori recognizable, which very often becomes pushed away in the field that we recognize as politics. Now, here politics may be mass politics, party politics, electoral politics, everyday negotiations with power, and so on and so forth, which is often seen as a domain called politics, but emptied, as it were, of the political principle. Now, this distinction then implies, and perhaps people like Claude Lefort and Jacques Rancière say it very explicitly, this implies that the political is really the foundational moment or the instituting moment. So Claude Lefort would say that the political is the instituting moment of society, in which then politics plays out. Jacques Rancière would make the distinction between what he would call the police, which is basically the everyday ordinary activities of parties, politics, representation, and so on and so forth, and the political, which is a kind of revolutionary break, as it were. Now, my attempt is to actually question this assumed priority of the political. Because I presume, I argue that once we assume the political as prior, it acquires a kind of axiomatic status, which then resists unpacking and rethinking and reopening. So I actually argue that ordinary everyday politics is also political, and as is those rare moments when a kind of rupture takes place in the order of things, and that we should take seriously ordinary people's everyday understanding of politics, without the philosopher's conceit, as it were, in judging whether people are political enough or not. Or if people say that, oh, we are not political and we do not want to be political, I would like to take that disavowal of politics equally seriously. So I want to collapse that distinction, as it were, between politics and political, in order to argue that not everything is political, but on the other hand, anything can be political in a certain conjuncture. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. I think that is, an absolutely key insight, argumentative line that you developed throughout the book. And I think, thinking from the Latin Americanist context, thinking about a recent thinker like Elias Palti, who has a book, Archaeology of the Political. Obviously, the word archaeology there is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but does, essentially try to trace a route that is via Schmitt, going back to, the absolute monarchies to establish this idea of politics versus the political. And even in the Latin American tradition, someone like Octavio Paz posits something like a tradition of rupture, but essentially uses the horizon of the French Revolution, kind of reifying this exact same distinction that you are disallowing. And you ended by talking about the philosopher's conceit. And when I first came to elementary aspects, the following captivated me, namely your aim, and I quote here, to displace philosophy itself from being the natural ground of the political. This is not to say I do not find philosophy relevant to thinking the political, nor do I argue for some kind of political realism by scorning the power of ideas. In fact, I shall talk of ideas frequently in this book, and in their diverse embodied and operationalized forms. I wish merely to say that philosophy must be seen as one, and only one, among the many protagonists that vie for supremacy around the question of the political. So could you elaborate a little bit on the way you understand philosophy and its your relationship to disallowing this politics in the political distinction?
Yeah, sure. So, as I write in the introduction pretty early on, that where I'm coming from, and many thinkers and activists from ex-colonial societies come from, is with the experience of being intensely political people. In fact, one of the main aspects of the post-colonial condition, I would argue, is this overdetermination by politics that we live and grow in. So we come as intensely political people, and yet we constantly, obsessively lament the lack of political philosophy. So we either compensate by borrowing concepts from Western European political philosophy, or in fact spend our time showing up how these concepts are Eurocentric and therefore not quite applicable to other than European contexts. Now, it's a kind of an impasse in my mind. So we, even in South Asian universities, as across the world, we teach politics and think politics through a narrative of great philosophers. So Hobbes, Locke, Marx, Foucault, Gambin, and so on. Or in trying to decolonize the canon, as it were, we say Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, Iqbal, Tavio Paz, whoever. The framing of political thought remains a kind of philosophical framing. Or, as I argue in the book, when we speak in ordinary, everyday political contexts, we are constantly quoting or citing what appears to be self-evident ideologies, right? So liberalism, nationalism, Marxism, fascism, anarchism. Now, even these are, to my mind, philosophical proxies. These are modular forms that we have received primarily from 19th century European thought as framing mechanisms for politics all over the world. Even discrete concepts such as secularity or civility or even rights, even democracy, as global and as universal as it can be, are genealogically tied to particular kinds of histories which have been reinvented, as it were, as Enlightenment Western European histories. Now, so the struggle for many of us across the world is to kind of get away from this larger framing device, which is done philosophically, and we tend to only put in different content in it without questioning the framing. Now, in this book, what I'm trying to argue, therefore, is that we not only need to get out of the philosophical framing of politics, but also interrogate the very category called philosophy itself. Now, if you would recall, late 18th to late 19th century is a period in European history when through kind of colonial channels, thought systems from across the world came to Europe. So, Chinese, early Chinese texts, Indian texts, texts from other parts of the world came into Europe, and a major debate ensued on whether these forms of thought can be called philosophy or not. And of course, the end of the day, the general opinion was that these were not philosophies. These were either symbolic modes of thinking, or religious modes of thinking, or even poetic modes of thinkings, but not philosophy as such, something that people like Hegel would definitely say, but so would somebody like Husserl say. And strangely enough, somebody like even Deleuze would passingly say in his book, What is Philosophy? So my attempt is to destabilize the very idea of philosophy itself, and also argue that in the everyday life of politics, what we recognize as philosophy or philosophical proxies, such as Marxism or liberalism, are only one of the players. There are other modes of thought, other modes of practice, and other modes of expression and formulation, where the literature question comes in very strongly, have an equal stake in kind of determining how the political becomes at any one point of time in history. So yeah, that's my kind of take on philosophy per se.
Thank you. Again, there's so much to unpack there, and I'm thinking of, from the Latin Americanist context, there's this idea by Roberto Schwartz about ideas out of place. And I think there's a lot of dialogue to be had here in the way you're kind of destabilizing this notion of thinking the political, this idea of received ideas, of these philosophical proxies. But I want to build on something that you ended with, which is talking about the literary. So I wonder if you could speak, in previous meetings of this group, we've discussed representation via art, literature, and otherwise, how it enables but also suppresses thought. And thinking of Joseph Slaughter's, the Bildungsroman as kind of being a vehicle enabling fiction for human rights discourse in multiple settings across the world. Did you find kind of multiple functions of art and culture? I guess we'll leave aside culture because you have a very clear distinction between aesthetics and futurity and culture and pastness. I guess maybe that could even be part of the question. Would you make the distinction between aesthetics and futurity on one hand and culture and pastness as a question of cultural representation?
Yes, indeed. The biggest material base of this book is actually literature and some visuals, but literature, theater, poetry, and so on and so forth. Now, and I find that in most of the world, as Partha Chatterjee would say, what we call the aesthetic or the literary or artistic is really the domain where thinking about future possibilities, which if one has to have a definition of politics, one would say that it is an art of the possible. That is where all the thinking and the practice happens. And one of the pleas that this book makes is that when we think about aesthetics, or again, aesthetics is a placeholding term here, but most broadly defined, aesthesis as something that has to do with the mobilization of the senses, and as something to do with bringing into being something which does not, quote unquote, exist really or exist actually, is really where political imagination comes into play. Now, having said that, I actually want to make a distinction between the representation question and the question of aesthetic effect. Now, politics has been mostly thought of in terms of representation, where both political representation and artistic or aesthetic representation in some senses, are two sides of the same coin. It is a certain temporal orientation in which those who are not literally present at a moment are made to appear as if to speak in their own voices or make the appearance in public spheres. Now, to my mind, and representation then takes its own trajectory. It becomes about demographic representation in politics. It becomes about voice of subaltern voices or marginal voices. It becomes about identity. It becomes about diversity. And representation, to my mind, is a technology of inclusion. But it is not, it does not quite restructure the frame or the stage or the institutional context in which representation is sought. Aesthetic effect in my reading is actually to do with the stage or the frame or the institutional context in which new beings appear. So therefore, I make the distinction between culture, identity, and history, which is on the side of representation, and what I call aesthetic futurity, which is in some senses about producing the effect of a new world in which senses are remapped, atmospherics are remapped, and people and in fact non-humans and non-life forms also come through in a way in which they had not come through earlier. And that's why it's not representation. It's not something which is out there in reality, which is now being brought into art or the parliament. New entities emerge. The people are no longer the same. The frame is no longer the same. What we see, what we hear is no longer the same. What we feel is no longer the same. And my feeling is that politics happens on that edge of aesthetic. So it's in that sense, I go away from also the debate about realism that is very much part of the aesthetics, the debate about political aesthetics, in which Soviet realism per se is at the heart of it. In fact, I'm actually arguing for the extra real or a new real that can be, but it is always momentary. It is not an attributable and stable identity. It is a momentary eruption of a new entity, and therefore imaginary. So that's so, which is why I kind of talk around the idea of the people as always torn between one kind of attempt to solidify the people in a perfect structure, which uses the technology of representation internally, which is the political party, as opposed to the idea of people as evanescent and a fiction, a believable fiction, I insist. It cannot be wild, it has to be believable, but it is nevertheless fiction and therefore evanescent. So that's the dialectic that I try to play with. I hope this is not too abstruse.
No, I don't think so. I think it's quite thought-provoking, and I'm thinking, in Latin Americanist context, there's this distinction between the archive and the repertoire. Deanna Taylor proposes, and this seems to be a complementary way of thinking with and beyond this archive and repertoire distinction, because the sense of embodied practices has a sense of kind of tradition and continuity that is very different than the documentary. And Deanna Taylor even puts bones and forensic records, which is very important in thinking Latin America recently. But I think one of the words you use to think about fiction and the people as credible fiction, as you call it in the book, and as you mentioned here today, is the idea of the stage. So could you tell us a little more about the role of popular theater in your analysis?
Right. So in my analysis, the stage comes in both literally and metaphorically. So I actually show that not just political theater per se, which is extremely important in the first half of the 20th century in staging people's power, as it were, but I also show how other literary genres, say the novel or the short story, actually uses theatrical mechanisms in its own emplotment, in its own modes of narration and expression. So literally, actually, the theatrical, as it were, becomes the primary repertoire, as you're rightly saying, of thinking the people of the future. But I also use the term stage metaphorically in order to take our attention away from the question of who is the people. Is the people the nation, the class, the mob, race, identity, crowd, population? So take the question away from the who question to the question of how a people acquire form and presence. And that, to my mind, is the technology of staging the people, including all the connotations of artifice, assemblage, impersonation. I mean, one of the very interesting examples that I play with in this chapter is about how middle-class communists play the peasant on stage in order to teach the peasant how to be communist peasants. Right, so this whole cycle of impersonations, so all the artifice of the whole thing is what I want to indicate by my use of the term stage. And in this I actually, so as one of the French thinkers that I really like, I've always read and really like reading is Jacques Rancière. And Rancière has a lot of stuff on politics of literature and politics of aesthetics and so on. And he makes the argument of a change from the archaic Greek tragedy theatrical mode of politics, which is what seeks to exhort the people into being, as it were, to the medieval romance, to finally the realist, 19th century realist novel, which is sees as a progressive story of democratization, because according to him, a realist novel is the one that elicits a democratic public as an anonymous reader. Whoever is with the novel is really the interlocutor. So it's a kind of democratizing force, as opposed to the stage of the archaic time, where the performer or the demagogue is in a hierarchical position to the audience whom he exhorts into being. Now, I in fact disagree with that chronology or this history of progressive democratization of the literary or the artistic, by arguing that it is very much in contemporary times that the dramaturgical becomes, in a sense, the foundation of what we understand to be the people and what we understand to be popular sovereignty. Which is why, as this wonderful historian of European theater, Martin Puchner, writes often, there's a huge anxiety in 19th and early 20th century avant-garde writing of reducing, of kind of eliminating drama and theater from modern modes of essays and novels, because the theater appears to be the excessive in which artistic parameters no longer remain stable, because that there is this kind of the artifice in some senses can spin out of control. And of course, all the story about how, the theater audience gets into a fight in Shakespeare's time, because that's the place where, the plebs have a kind of equal power with the aristocrats and so on. So that's a longer story. It's absolutely fascinating how stage is so much at the center of, even modern day politics, right? Narendra Modi here, or Donald Trump in America, or Erdogan, or in some ways are absolute stage performers. Except that the media is different. The media is a digital media that creates other kind of considerations that we have to take into account. But the question of the staging, is absolutely important, even in kind of contemporary politics, to my mind.
Thank you. I think, and perhaps this is a way to kind of think about also law and performance, which is something that I've been seeing more and more of, right? This kind of understanding of legal through this framework. And I do think there's space to discuss here also this challenging of this kind of progressive, if I may say, teleological, notion that's related to aesthetic categories and forms of realization in the political, and counter narrative, although even calling it counter narrative is a loaded way of phrasing it. Structure of anti-colonial world making in Adam Getachu's understanding of the nation as still something that's here in this post-imperial world order. But staying on the category of the theater and aesthetics, could you tell us a little bit about rasa and bhava and the role it plays precisely in establishing how something becomes a credible fiction?
Yeah, it's a fascinating aesthetic tradition that has, to my mind, been not really used as well as it can be. It's generally seen as esoteric and archaic, and kind of pushed to specialists of kind of early Indic aesthetics. So let me put it very simply. It's a very, very complex tradition with many internal debates. And so there is no one rasa theory, even though it might be often projected like that. There are multiple ways in which it got to be glossed across the centuries. And it also gets invoked in the 20th century by very, very important literateurs and dramatists, which is somehow very often not discussed. So I was trying to kind of tease that aspect out. Now, very simply speaking, rasa is literally means relish or juice. It's the essence, as it were, that one feels when one encounters any kind of aesthetic or artistic artifact, be it theater or be it poetry, or be it quote unquote the God. Now, the term bhava means expression of an emotion or expression of a particular aesthetic relish. But literally, the term bhava comes from the root word bhu, which is the word for the world. And so bhava is a mode of expression that actually can bring the world into being. So it is understood as not just an aesthetic expression per se, but a successful expression which actually brings into being a new world. Right. Now, one of the central principles of rasa theory, if we can glean that, is the argument that an aesthetic experience, it has neither to do with representation nor to do with experience. In the sense, say I am sitting in the audience and watching a wonderful actor perform a role on the stage. Now, if and it's a terrifying war scene in which the actor is going to be slayed any moment. Now, if I experience the emotion of heroism and fear as if it is my own. In other words, if I see it as my own experience, I will not be able to achieve an aesthetic achievement, because I will then be paralyzed by fear or become myself a heroic figure. So aesthetic achievement is not experience. At the same time, if I see it as a representation, that is, if it has to do with something abstract or something abstract thing called fear as such, or an experience of another person on the stage, then also I do not achieve aesthetic experience, because then I'm not moved. Then I remain cerebral, as it were. I recognize it as a good and a perfect representation of what fear can be, but it doesn't involve me. So the aesthetic experience is what transcends this binary between the representation on the one hand and immediate experience on the other. So the idea in rasa theory, or a successful bhava which brings in a new world, is the idea that a wonderful theater or a wonderful music or a wonderful literature is only wonderful insofar I can immerse myself in what I recognize as a generalized state of being in which I feel at one with everyone else. So it's called sadharanikaran, which simply means generalization. So aesthetic experience of a rasa as a generalized experience, as a kind of collective experience, rather than either my own representation or my own experience. That's the idea of rasa theory, basically. And there's a lot of debate about how important is the audience or the reader, or how important is the performer or the poet. And there is always a kind of, imbalance between the two. Some theorists actually say it is the audience who is primary. Some theorists would say it's the poet. So there are all sorts of debates, but the idea of going beyond both immediate experience and formal representation is the crux that I want to mobilize in my own argument about the people as a credible fiction. So there.
Thank you. Yes, and this, that's, I think, a crucial part of the argumentation, and there are so many of these kind of binaries that you're troubling. In the article you shared on Ambedkar, right? This idea of reason versus faith as well. Even self versus collective is troubled in this understanding of Rasa Bhava. But one of the things that comes across clearly in our conversation is how seriously you take language, and I'm thinking of this is also something analyzed in the writers in your book. And I'm thinking of this anecdote about, I forget the name of the writer, but a Bengali writer who has this essay on economics, and then ends the essay by saying, please do not translate this into English. I absolutely love that. But so, in thinking from the Global South, questions of translation, of style, whether this effect could be, I don't want to say reproduced, but would be valid, as it were, even if that's a troubling way of saying it, across traditions and languages, is something that occupies my mind, thinking from the Latin Americanist perspective. And so in this kind of frame, I wonder if you could tell us, before we open up to questions, and maybe you could talk a little bit about your current research, the idea of the Global South itself, which you've used this word already today, but as a placeholder. So you talked about certain categories or terminology signifiers as placeholders, and you call the Global South also a placeholder. So how do you see the Global South as operationalized in your work? Perhaps how does it relate to questions of the post-colonial and or the decolonial?
Sure, thank you. So you're right. The way I use the term Global South is only as a placeholder, in the sense that I think as of now, at this moment, it is a term that has less baggage attached to it than many other terms, such as the West and the East, of course, which has a long kind of civilizational charge to it, which is very different. Or the earlier terms, which were very geopolitical in nature, the third world, the fourth world, and so on. So Global South seems more ambiguous. And I actually say that I see it as a non-place, and precisely because it is not geopolitically determined as such, that it allows a greater facility of movement, a greater facility of conversations across languages. And you're right, conversations across languages is both the most exciting and the most difficult part of this enterprise, in which, of course, translation is at the heart of it, but also the struggle with the untranslatables, and how and the question of what happens when translation fails, or when one mistranslates or misrecognizes. Is that generative in itself, or is it an end of thought, as it were? Now, these are tough questions that all of us will struggle with. I think one of the things that I have thought further when talking of the Global South, I talked of it in a particular way in the book. Subsequently, three things struck me as additional questions that one will have to struggle with if one wants to inhabit the Global South, as it were, in solidarity with others in this sphere. One, of course, is the question, and this ties up a little bit with what I'm thinking now, the question of why some disciplines have opened themselves up to post-colonial and decolonial rethinking. And in this, I, of course, mean the humanities disciplines, but also to some extent associated disciplines like law and quote unquote the social sciences and so on. Why some disciplines, however, have resisted the post-colonial and the decolonial moment, and what does a Southern perspective mean in our encounter with these disciplines? And in this, of course, the most obvious is science, technology, and economics. Now, disciplines that in some senses rule the world, but have not really been understood as thinkable in terms of plural traditions or diverse traditions. They are thinkable so far as the colonial genealogies of these disciplines can be demonstrated. So one can demonstrate how modern political economy emerges from colonial governmental thinking. But can one demonstrate what different traditions of economics can be? Or can one indeed talk of something that this philosopher of technology, the Hong Kongese philosopher of technology, Yu Hui says, can one even imagine something called technodiversity, which in some sense reflects what we know and recognize as cosmodiversity or multiple cosmologies that we live in? It seems to me as yet that we have not quite imagined a possibility of a Southern perspective on technology beyond saying that technology comes out of Silicon Valley and we may use it differently, or we may overwrite it by another program. But can we even ask the question of the concept of an algorithm or the concept of a program from different cosmological perspectives or different life experiences. So I think that's where I think we are stuck, and we need to think really, really hard. And here, actually, the language question becomes kind of displaced. Here, the question is of other languages, symbolic languages, binary languages, or non-language, data, and so on and so forth. The third aspect of the Global South that I am forced to think a little more about has to do with the question of time rather than the question of space. Because the territorial imagination of Global South, in which we have some kind of an identification of what we are talking about when we say Global South. I mean, Latin America, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. What happens when we set the territorial imagination aside and ask, is the Global South in some ways a different temporality from the metatemporality of the modern? Are we at a place where we can even begin to dislodge the grip of this meta-category called modern from our thinking, and from the thinking of ordinary people? I mean, in India, on the street, the ordinary person is still waiting for modernity to happen and hoping that the troubles of his life or her life will go away when true modernity will happen. And we know that it's never going to happen. And but nevertheless, ordinary persons on the streets' imagination of an emancipatory future is still in the grip of the idea of the modern, which is itself a part of the problem rather than a part of the solution, right? So I'm trying to ask myself whether the Global South can be re-thematized in terms of a temporal configuration rather than a kind of territorial or a spatial configuration, as it were. So these are the three ways in which I'm struggling with the term Global South, and my inhabitation of the South, therefore, is kind of uneasy, as it were.
Yeah, that's a huge bundle of questions, right? And I think one of the ways to think about it is thinking what is the legal is also, I think, a way in, because the legal has a very specific construction of time, and even giving the category the legal to certain categories. For example, thinking from the Colombian context, some are called, normative systems versus indigenous legal doctrine, which also
Sure.
opens up questions of putting within these metatemporalities. I think there would be an argument to be made there. But I'd like to open to questions from our audience, if that's all right. So if anyone would like to talk, please take off your microphone, raise your hand, turn on your camera. I have tons of questions, so no pressure, but we'd love to hear from you. And that's the kind of the point of this group that brings people from various parts of the world, the Global South and Global North included.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can write on the chat too, if you prefer.
Hello, everybody. I am Beatriz Botero. I am in Wisconsin in the United States. Thank you for your talk. It was amazing, all of these ideas. And there are some topics that I want you, if you can develop a little bit more. One is this idea of the stage performance, and this idea that I link with the concept of narcissism when you talk about all of these characters from the politicians who were right now part of the world. We cannot just think think that they don't exist, because right now the world changed because of all of these big personalities. Also the other concept about how the language is not anymore in the center, even though that the people are thinking about the binary and how to express, how to bring the marginality from the language. Because it's the first way of making a space for the marginals, I would say. And yeah, and this idea of the tempo, the temporality in the center now. And that's the way that the marginals right now are getting into the center. It's fascinating. Thank you very much for your talk.
So should I respond, or are we taking more questions?
You can respond. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Beatriz, and thank you for joining us. The first question about the performance of the authoritarian politicians that we are struggling with today. So what I'm trying to argue is not so much about the performativity of the character of the leader. That too, that is as important. But I'm trying to ask ourselves to pay more attention to the staging and the framing devices in which these performances come to us. So, for instance, if you look at Trump's campaign videos, the short videos, many of them are made by the campaign itself, but many of them are made by fans and supporters. And all of them are short YouTube video kind of stuff. And they very often riff off on Hollywood action movie, right? In the way that walks happen, in the way that the camera pans from bottom up, in the way that the soundtrack is used, in the way that the cuts, the edits happen, in the way that the crowd itself is staged in a video, looking up at Trump. It's a fascinating staging technology. So to my mind, more interesting and more important, as it were, than Trump's own performance is this entire frame, without which that performance would not do its work, including the mobilization of the real American people that Trump kind of brought into being, as it were. Now, I can take similar examples from my part of my country, how Modi's media blitzkrieg basically created what we see as Hindutva politics in India. And it is very much to do with framing and staging, of which the performance is a small part. So I'm in fact trying to get away from performance theory, as it were, in understanding identity politics. So that's the first question. The second question about language. So now I have trained myself, and I enjoy working with language materials. And as you know, where I come from, India is itself a land of multiple languages and multiple interesting literary oeuvres that we can work with. But I'm getting increasingly concerned, I'm struggling to think about how communication and mobilization and expression and efficacy, as it were, happen in extralingual ways. In other words, from taking the simplest of example, which is that you go into a rally of a Hindu party, and you talk to many supporters of Hindutva, the talk makes no difference. In other words, language exchange, we may be talking in the same language. We may even be talking in the same idioms. Hindi, from Delhi, let me put it like that. But the limit of discourse, per se, linguistic discourse, comes through very clearly. Because communication and mobilization is happening in ways other than that of speech and discursivity. Our imagination of the old public sphere as primarily a discursive sphere is something that we really have to get over. because that is what is taking us by surprise when we actually go out into the world of real politics and see that while there are words flying around everywhere, much of the actual stuff is happening in ways other than discursively. And from this kind of a simple example to a far more complex question of how does one think of the contemporary planetary turn, or call it cosmological turn or cosmopolitical turn, which all of us now must think through in context of this pressing ecological crisis. In that context, how does one think of non-human and non-life forms within the framework of language? Can one? I doubt it. I mean, Jane Bennett's new book is very interesting because she is trying to, and in a very different context, Ranajit Guha, the pioneer subalternists, new writings in Bengali. He doesn't write in English anymore. Now, what I see that both Ranajit Guha writing in Bengali and Jane Bennett writing from an American academic context are asking this question. So Jane Bennett is asking, can one think of a voice in language which is other than that of the active voice or the passive voice? Because neither the active voice nor the passive voice actually captures the efficacy of plants, animals, minerals, machines, and gods, right? Can there be a middle voice, is what she asks. So she's really pushing at the boundary of what we understand as language. And Ranajit Guha, in a very, very different context, talks about how cosmic temporality, as it were, how it kind of breaks up the syntactical coherence of human language. And the only way one can sense the cosmicity of time or of the astral bodies is by giving up on what we understand as meaning or semantics of language. So I think the language, when we are from the linguistic turn moment, I think we are getting to a moment which has to think language as one amongst many modes of efficacy, as it were. So.
Well, since I'm the moderator, I'll allow myself to speak. And so I'm having a bit of issues with my camera, which is why I'm connecting and disconnecting. So hopefully it will work. So I'm going to put my question on the chat. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation, both to Joe and to Professor Banerjee. And I really admire your clarity and your eloquence. So let me say that first. And so my question is, there is a tension in your book between, on the one hand, I'm quoting you, understanding the nature and limits of the modern political, as you claim in the epilogue, and recognizing that there is no essence of the political. And so I was just curious about how kind of you reconcile these two claims. And a question that I think is connected is, what is the conceptual work that modernity is doing for you? At several points, you talk about the distinction between philosophy and history, and I would wonder if modernity is a concept that you place on the side of history or on the side of philosophy. And you know, in your last intervention before we move to the Q&A, you said that modernity is a concept that we need in a way to overcome, and that is something that I agree with. But it's at the same time is a concept that you kind of use. So I wonder, is it possible to use it without activating the assumptions that you're trying to question in your book?
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, this is something that I have realized post facto after having published the book, as often happens with authors and gives them sleepless nights later, that there is indeed a bit of a tension in the book, and which you correctly identify as, on the one hand, trying to implode the very concept of the political as we know it. On the other hand, still holding on to what might appear to be a residual political, right? And that's very, very well describes my own personal condition, which is to say that, and again, without kind of expressing any kind of hubris, I might say that this might pretty well be shared by many of my colleagues and comrades and friends, which is to say that we have a critique of the way in which politics has emerged, or let me put it like this. We have a very clear critique of what can now be called political determinism. That at the end of the day, when you can't explain anything, you just say, oh, there's a politics to it, or this is political, or there can only be a political answer, without actually then asking what does it even mean to say that this is a so that we have that critique, and we realize that from so when we were young, we had a faith in this formulation that everything is politics, and we lived and grew through this idea that everything is politics and everything can be resolved politically, and there will always be a political answer, and that we will know where to find it. And with time, that clearly that faith kind of got displaced. On the other hand, we cannot also say in any honesty and fairness that we have given up on politics. By no means. We are still seeking political answers. On the realization, however, that some issues may actually actively resist a political resolution or a political answer. So one distinction that I make in the book, and which is pretty much at the heart of the book, is that between the non-political and the extra-political, right? The non-political is so when political philosophy, modern political philosophy emerges, it emerges by distinguishing politics from religion, distinguishing politics from society. So, religion, Max Weber; society, Thomas Hobbes; from economics, Adam Smith; from aesthetics, Immanuel Kant. I write that in the introduction itself. And then 20th century critical theory politicizes all these. Right, so it politicizes religion, it politicizes sexuality, it politicizes society, and so on. So the non-political is that which emerges as a way of delimiting and defining the political, only to be subsequently politicized, such that we come to a moment where we think that everything is political without excess, without remainder, without surplus. Against this idea of the non-political as that which is not yet political but imminently so, I pitch the idea of the extra-political as that which cannot be that easily politicized. Mm-hmm. Right. And again, if you come back to today's context, let us say the non-human or the cosmological is one such aspect to which we will ask political questions, no doubt, but it is not easy to translate that into politics as we know it. So when, for instance, Bruno Latour will talk about the parliament of things, or Lévi-Briand will talk about the democracy of objects, what happens is that basically we are imposing structures of human politics on non-human and non-life things and hoping that it'll work. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's what I'm getting at when I say that there is a place where we can reach, where we have to ask, what does the political concept of justice look like? What does the political concept of rights look like? Or the legal concept of rights look like? What does the political concept of equality look like if the entity concerned is a non-human? And not just a lovely horse, but a virus. And not just an AI endowed friendly robot, but a fearsome god. Right. So I'm just, you see what I mean? So that's where the tension comes from. I'm well aware of the tension of trying to hold on to politics and yet having to admit that there can be a limit to politics where we may ask the unthinkable question, if not politics, then what, as it were.
Hen?
Thank you so much for this very interesting conversation. I have a question about fictions and about, you're writing about fictions as something that in many senses constitutes peoplehood and the political and aesthetic effect as, where politics happens. And I wanted to ask you about two different categories that I think we should also consider when we're talking about the stage, because there are multiple stages that the people are exposed to today. I think we have to consider, first of all, the category of place and the category of globalization. And the example I'll give is that, as I told you, I'm in a country where there are now massive demonstrations against the government, who's trying to turn the country into a dictatorship. And one of the questions that people raise is why the younger generation is not joining these demonstrations in masses. I'm talking about teenagers, people who are still in school. And I think that, if we think about, you're writing about fictions, these people are not reading, the literature of the place, but they're watching Netflix. So, if we think about the identity that is constituted there, it's not the people, or there's no, peoplehood there, but they may have very clear ideas about, reality shows that are happening in the US or in Dubai, but not about what is happening here. So I think through globalization and the kind of fictions that globalization creates, there is something that, there's this fraction between place and the politics of the place where the people are, and the narratives and the fictions that they're exposed to, and that constitutes, their politics or non-politics. So I was wondering what you think about that, because I think that's, one of the big stories of our culture, our global culture today.
Oh, I totally agree with you. What can I say? I mean, that is pretty much a good description of India at this time. Two or three kind of basically thinking with you, offhand responses. So when I was a kid in school, and I come from, a literate, lower middle class family, so not non-literate, but also not particularly affluent or with great access to Western objects of desire. But let me tell you, what we all grew up on European imageries, not just European texts, which was part of school curriculum, but European imageries. So this is pre-globalization times that I'm talking about. So, my school library was full of, I don't even know whether you guys will even remember this name. You're too young for it. Somebody called Enid Blyton, and her,
I read her growing up.
Oh my goodness, think of that. We learned English by reading Enid Blyton, and by all means, it is the most white, forgive me, racist, but also charming kind of books. And when I came to college, and since I come from a very small town in Bengal, when I first came to the big city, I felt completely out of the loop, because you know what young girls were reading at that time? This is 90s, as late as the 90s, something called Mills and Boons. Do you know what that is? That's a terrifyingly atrocious form of romance novels. Again, highly race-based and awfully, patriarchal and whatever. So I'm saying that this thing of being of really becoming out of touch with your own place is not new. Having said that, you are very right that what we call the globalization moment has created a qualitative difference in the connectivity of the world. And here, I think, the question, the truly, truly important question is the question of technology. It's not the question of content. The content is the post facto thing, in the sense that this kind of imagination of living in a world that is not exactly here and now, but some imaginary idea of what it is to be a global youth, is something which is entirely staged. And that is why I keep harping on the terms frame and staged, by new forms of OTT platforms, new forms of social media, and the content in some ways is tailored to the affordances of these technologies. So to my mind, the debate really needs to go there, rather than saying that should Netflix India be full of local cinematic productions rather than. But the interesting thing is that the OTTs, now India is full of OTTs. So Netflix is one, Amazon is the other, but there are many, many, many local Indian OTTs that have come through as well. And I have to tell you that we now see actually a fantastic flourishing of small budget digital cinema and series in the Indian languages, which was not possible when the cinema industry was, when the cinema field was only industrial, which meant that it was only done through celluloid and through mega productions. We actually have more diverse content. That's an interesting thing. Nevertheless, there is absolutely no discussion on the frame and format. What does Instagram do to what can even be staged on Instagram and what cannot be? That's the question that we have to ask, rather than if you focus only on the content part of it, which is important, and that's the most evident one and the most visible one, no doubt. But I'm saying that it is the technological repackaging of content that gives a certain power to that content, or the efficacy to that content, rather than opposite. I mean, I can tell you something far more closer to us academics. Now, living in India, I find huge amounts of scholarship now available on the internet. As you know, some legal sites, some pirated sites. But it has made access fantastically easier compared to when we were students, when I had to wait to write to a friend in America who would then do a photocopy of a book that was not available, then post it to me, and then it'll get lost. Right? As opposed to that, I just get a pirated copy from some site of a book. Now, I mean, this is, of course, dangerous talk, so we should be careful. However, if you look for Indian language materials on the net, you will find very, very little. So there is a new form of inequality that is emerging when we have moved beyond the book to the screen. You see what I mean? So it is, in some sense, a technological framing that is the question of, that is the subject of debate and I don't think we have even gone there as yet. We haven't talked about, I mean, we have. I mean, it's not as if there are a small handful of people who are discussing this. What does it even mean to decolonize technology? What does it even mean to pluralize technology? Or sorry, I just went on for too long.
No, that was a fantastic answer. Nicole?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I suppose I had a question around the idea of the question of the stage and politics and the staging of politics and how that relates to the question of truth or truth telling or lack thereof. So how this can be useful to think problems like post-truth. And even very, in a very related way to what you were just saying right now about not just the contents, right? It's not just a question of the contents, it's a question of the way in which the stage produces specific modalities, specific techniques, and in which it frames what can be said and what cannot be said, but also what seems to have become possible is to say something that doesn't sit on the side of either truth or falsity. And so I was just wondering if you have some thoughts about this. Thank you so much.
It's really the question of politics today, as all of us would agree. I really do not have a good answer to this question. One of the, I mean, let me kind of speak in a kind of more personal way. So one of the things that we are struggling with in India at this time is the attempt by the Hindu right to basically spread lies of all kinds, which is including about the past, including about history, but also about today. Now, from the 1990s onwards, progressive activists and intellectuals have been loudly trying to make factual corrections to these things. Right, so telling that this is not what happened, this is not right, this is not true, and here is the evidence. The question that except it really hasn't worked. That argument didn't work, of that this being not kind of true, and there is evidence for that. Clearly, untrue things with no evidence is believed and acted upon. So then the question to ask about truth is that, is it truth which has efficacy, or is it what a truth effects? And again, this becomes the aesthetic question, right? The effect question. And this is something that I would imagine is very much part of the question of positive law, right? Where, I mean, even setting aside the contemporary moment, the contemporary post-truth moment, one of the biggest tensions within the field of legal thinking, I mean, I am only speaking as an outsider here, I really do not know, is the fact that what is understood as legal truth or evidentiary truth often doesn't do justice to the truth of justice, as it were. Right, so all the work that Derrida has done in terms of the difference between law and justice and the two truths thereof is, in some senses, about the question of what some truths can be made to do or made to work for, and what some truths cannot be made to work for. So my feeling is that we are actually thinking, why is the historians insistence that there is no evidence of the fact that this particular mosque was built on the place of a Hindu god's birth? It has absolutely no purchase whatsoever. Why is that? Because this truth, it is a truth, no doubt, but this truth doesn't do the political work that a political truth needs to do. And so and there it is, therefore. And of course, you know, the political aesthetic scholarship actually comes from the Nazi times, right? The Walter Benjamin kind of idea that aestheticization of politics is basically an authoritarian mode in which people make people believe in a fantasy of some kind of, you know, transcendence of history and becoming the true people of the world. I'm trying to argue that it's not only about bad politics that the aesthetic question comes into play, but it actually also comes into play in context of what we call progressive or good politics. It is the battle of different kinds of aesthetic deployments and the amenability of some truths to actually become effective and some not. And I think it's also again a temporal question. Some truths, I mean, you could kill yourself talking, you know, speaking truth to power, as it were. And people have killed themselves speaking truth to power, and they continue to do so, you know, both in Israel and Palestine and in Turkey and in India and in so many other parts of the world. It's just not the moment. But this moment will also not last. So we have to think of truth and untruth as also playing with, in some senses, time, and you know, seizing time or making time. So to kind of counter an untruth, a truth will have to make its own time, which is the political work, rather than just quote evidence or quote its trueness. I mean, this is not a good answer, Nicole. I'm quite aware of it, but
No, I think there's many elements that make this a very interesting and rich answer. And I don't know that anybody has a good answer, full stop. But actually, there's a lot in this that I think is very useful. Thank you so much about that.
Well, I do want to be mindful of time, and I know it is late in Delhi, and there's so much already to think about, and this has been so rich. So I'd just like to thank you all, and just to, you know, leave on the table some of these questions, even the idea of voice. If we invoke Caballero, right? Is this even something that is only thinkable through the political? And what would that mean for even thinking more than human representation? And then we have Marisol de la Cadena, who has this idea of the anthropo not seen, right? And then even there, what is the visual metaphor? What is the baggage of this thinking through the visual that would be complicated by thinking through staging? So, I mean, there's so much to do. Evidentiary regimes, truth and juridical form, right? To invoke Foucault here, right? I don't know. There's so much to think here, and this has been so rich, and my mind is spinning out of control. But we'd just like to thank you, Professor Banerjee. This has been wonderful, and thank you, Hen, Nicole, Victoria, Angelo, for helping coordinate and make this happen. Thank you, Stanford Global Studies, for also helping make this happen. And we'll censor out that part about the pirated. Don't worry.
Oh yeah, sorry. I mean, it just came out.
No, I'm kidding. I think in academia, it is absolutely crucial to have those types of ways to access text.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for doing this. Hopefully we'll keep in touch and speak more other times. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Bye.